Imagine a sound that makes your teeth rattle. A low, guttural roar of artillery that hasn't stopped for 2 weeks straight. The crash of falling concrete, the screech of metal, and shouts, drowned out by the revving of tank engines. Now, imagine silence. On May 2nd, 1945, this sudden silence deafened Berlin more than any explosion. Dust slowly settled on the ruins of a city that, just a month ago, was the capital of Europe. In that moment, the heart of a massive machine stopped beating. The 1,000-year Reich, which was supposed to rule the planet forever, lasted exactly 12 years and 3 months. For millions, this silence meant the first breath of freedom. But for a specific group of men, it sounded like a verdict. We are talking about those who built this machine. The men in gray and black uniforms, the generals, the ideologues, and the enforcers. In a single second, they transformed from the masters of life into the most wanted prey in human history. The Germans call this time Stunde Null, hour zero. The air over Germany in those days had a specific smell. It was the scent of smoke mixed with burning paper. In thousands of offices, from Berlin to Munich, feverish work was underway. Picture the panic in the corridors of power. Men who yesterday decided the fate of nations with a single signature were now kneeling before fireplaces and metal bins. They were burning the archives. Thousands of hands tore through secret protocols. Personnel files of agents were flushed down toilets until the plumbing clogged with paper mache. Golden party badges, symbols of the elite, were tossed into roadside ditches. Luxurious uniforms with oak leaves on the lapels were hastily swapped for the worn-out clothes of gardeners and laborers. The fear was palpable, because every one of them knew the Allies were close, and they weren't coming just to win. They were coming to judge. But the real psychological break happened a little earlier. On May 1st, Hamburg radio interrupted its broadcast. After a long pause, Bruckner's Seventh Symphony began to play, slow, solemn, and somber. And then the announcer's voice, trembling with tension, spoke the words no one had dared to whisper for years. Adolf Hitler is dead. For us today, this is just a historical fact in a textbook. But try to understand the psychology of an SS officer in 1945. Their entire value system, their careers, and their morality hinged on one individual. They didn't swear an oath to Germany. They swore an oath to the Führer personally. And when the radio went silent, their universe collapsed. Their pact was terminated unilaterally. From that moment on, it was every man for himself. The single organism disintegrated into thousands of frightened cells. The code of honor no longer applied. Hierarchy lost its meaning. Headquarters telephone lines were dead, or answered in a foreign language. The most loyal inner circle was left with only one instinct, the primal instinct of survival. In this chaos, the largest escape attempt in history began. Some, unable to bear the void, reached immediately for a cyanide capsule. Others were already stuffing backpacks with forged papers and valuables, hoping to dissolve into the crowd of refugees. But there was a third group, those who refused to believe in reality. Amidst the smoking ruins, in the far north of the country, near the Danish border, a group of high-ranking officers gathered to play their final, completely insane game. While the whole world celebrated victory, they decided to pretend that the Reich was still alive. They created a government that shouldn't have existed, and it was led by a man Hitler had appointed as his successor at the very last minute. Let's move 500 kilometers northwest of burning Berlin, to the port city of Flensburg. Here, in the buildings of the Naval Academy, time seemed to stand still. No dust, no bomb craters. Men in perfectly pressed uniforms walked silently through red brick corridors. They saluted. They followed protocol. At the center of this strange picture stood Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, a man with a cold gaze and a reputation as an icy professional, commander of the U-boat fleet. It was him, not the party officials, that Hitler named the new Reich president in his political testament. It seems like a joke, but Dönitz took it deadly seriously. While tanks rolled through the streets of Berlin, a new cabinet of ministers met in Flensburg. Imagine the level of absurdity. Germany is completely occupied. The Wehrmacht is broken. Cities lie in ruins. And these men sit at a polished oak table and begin a meeting. They discuss exchange rates. They appoint new ministers. They write memorandums on the future structure of Europe. They seriously argue about flag protocol and which font to use on official letterhead. It was the strangest role-playing game of the 20th century. Secretaries typed orders that no one was left to obey. Couriers carried folders from office to office. Dönitz even held a situation briefing every morning at 10 a.m. He looked at a map that was turning redder by the hour with enemy markers and gave orders to fleets that no longer existed. The peak of this theater of the absurd was the arrival of Heinrich Himmler. The head of the SS, a man feared by all of Europe, arrived in Flensburg with a motorcade of personal guards. He was certain that a place as the second in command awaited him in the new government. The scene of their meeting is worthy of a Hollywood drama. Dönitz looked coldly at Himmler and stated that his services were no longer required, that the SS had stained the honor of the uniform. And Himmler, the all-powerful Reichsfuhrer, simply walked out, dejected and confused, like a fired clerk. In this sanctuary, the Nazis tried to convince themselves they were still in power, that the Allies would speak to them as equals, that they could negotiate an honorable peace. The illusion shattered on the morning of May 23rd. The building was surrounded by British commandos and tanks. Operation Blackout. No gentlemen's negotiations. No diplomatic protocol. The British stormed in. They marched the government into the courtyard with rifle butts. They lined them up against the wall, hands behind their heads. They searched them thoroughly. They checked their mouths, looking for poison capsules. Grand Admiral Dönitz was outraged. He shouted that this was a violation of international law, that he was a head of state. In response, a British officer simply shoved him forward. The Flensburg bubble burst. The ghosts turned out to be ordinary men of flesh and blood. They were loaded into trucks and taken to prison. But not everyone was ready to play this comedy to the end. Not everyone harbored hopes for negotiations. In the bunkers of Berlin and the luxurious villas of Bavaria, hundreds of other officers realized there would be no trial, because there would be no one left to judge. They chose another exit, an exit that fit inside a small glass capsule. In April 1945, the scarcest commodity in Berlin wasn't bread, or even ammunition. The most coveted item was a small brass casing. Inside it was a thin glass ampule containing cyanide. On the streets, they called it the one-way ticket. History knows many examples of mass tragedy, but what happened in Germany in the spring of '45 has no parallel. It was an epidemic, a psychosis that gripped an entire nation. Propaganda had told the Germans for years, if we lose, we will be destroyed. We will be enslaved. And when the front collapsed, the fear of captivity outweighed the instinct for self-preservation. In the town of Demmin alone, about 1,000 people took their own lives in 3 days. Entire families tied themselves together and walked into the freezing river. Fathers made terrible choices for their wives and children before ending it themselves. They believed it was an act of mercy. But in the bunker under the Chancellery, this horror reached its peak. Let's talk about the Goebbels family. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, and his wife, Magda. They had 6 children. All their names started with the letter H. On May 1st, Magda Goebbels put the children to bed. She told them they needed a vaccination so they wouldn't get sick in the damp bunker. In reality, it was a sedative. When the children fell asleep, she returned to the room. In her hands were the cyanide capsules. Picture the scene: a mother, 6 sleeping children, and total silence underground while artillery thundered overhead. She went to each one and ensured they would never wake up. Later, she would write in a farewell letter, "The world that will come after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in." This is the key phrase to understanding their psychology. Fanaticism had consumed their humanity. They couldn't imagine themselves in a world where they were not the masters, where they were ordinary mortals. Generals of the Wehrmacht and SS followed this example by the hundreds. Walter Model, the famous field marshal, ended his life in a forest near Duisburg. Hans Krebs, chief of the Army General Staff, did the same in the bunker. In Berlin, doctors recorded thousands of poisoning cases in a week. People took the poison on park benches, in restaurants during a final dinner, at their desks. It was their final act of control. You cannot judge us if we are not here. Cyanide has a characteristic smell of bitter almonds. They say this scent hung in the corridors of power, like a thick fog. Death seemed to them a noble exit, a Roman finale. But history played a cruel joke here too. Many ampules were old or defective. The end was not instant and painless, as promised, but agonizing. However, not all high-ranking officials were in a hurry to leave this world. The 2 most powerful men in the Reich, after Hitler, saw the situation differently. They had no desire to die. On the contrary, their egos were so inflated they believed in their own untouchability. They considered themselves not criminals, but political figures of global scale. While some were biting down on glass, these 2 were packing their bags. One took mountains of champagne. The other shaved off his famous mustache. If the suicides in the bunkers were a Shakespearean tragedy, the story of Hermann Göring resembled a bad comedy. May 7th. Austria. A strange procession appears on the road. It's not a column of prisoners or refugees. It's a convoy of expensive limousines. Inside rides the Reichsmarshal, the man who promised that no bomb would ever fall on Berlin. Göring wasn't fleeing. He was driving to a meeting. In his luggage were 16 enormous suitcases. Inside, silk underwear with monograms, crocodile skin toiletry kits, jewels worth millions, and of course a stash of his favorite pills, about 20,000 of them. Göring's psychology at this moment is astonishing. He genuinely believed that after Hitler's death, he automatically became the leader. He was driving to Eisenhower, not to surrender. He was driving to negotiate, as gentleman to gentleman. He rehearsed his speech. He imagined how he and the American general would shake hands, drink champagne, and discuss how to fight their common enemies together. Reality hit him hard. Instead of a handshake from Eisenhower, he was met by the gun barrels of ordinary soldiers from the 36th Texas Infantry Division. To them, he wasn't a statesman. He was an enemy figure in a ridiculous sky blue uniform. They took his ceremonial dagger. They tore off his epaulets. They confiscated the suitcases of silk. And most importantly, they found a jar of face cream containing hidden poison capsules. Göring was in shock. He shouted that this was a mistake, that he was the Führer's successor, but they simply shoved him into the back of a truck. In that moment, the bubble of his grandeur burst. The great hunter was now in a cage. His main rival acted very differently. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the camps, a man whose name caused trembling from Paris to Moscow. He understood there would be no negotiations, so he chose the path of the chameleon. Himmler shaved his famous mustache, put a black patch over his left eye, put on the worn uniform of a field police sergeant, and carried papers in the name of Heinrich Hitzinger. For 2 weeks, he wandered through the forests of northern Germany with a group of other disguised officers. They blended into the stream of refugees. Himmler, who was used to perfect cleanliness and order, now slept on the ground and ate canned food. Irony of fate. German bureaucracy destroyed him. At a British checkpoint near the Bremervörde Bridge, soldiers were checking the papers of thousands of people. Most refugees' papers were dirty, crumpled with smeared stamps. That was normal for the end of the war, but Sergeant Hitzinger's papers were perfect. Fresh stamps, not a single smudge. This raised suspicion. The British decided to detain the too clean sergeant to verify his identity. He was taken to an interrogation camp. Himmler realized the game was over. He took off the eye patch, put on his glasses, and quietly told the duty officer, "I am Heinrich Himmler." The officer didn't believe him, but intelligence was called. The search began. Himmler was stripped. A doctor began to examine his mouth. They were looking for the same thing they found on Göring, the capsule. The doctor saw a strange blue glint in a hollow tooth. He tried to reach in with his fingers. Himmler jerked his head and sharply clamped his jaw shut. The crunch of glass was heard. The smell of bitter almonds instantly filled the room. The British rushed at him. They turned him face down, tried to clear his stomach. A major shouted, "Hold him! Don't let him go!" But the poison acted instantly. Within 15 minutes, the most feared man in Europe was dead. He lay on the floor, defeated. The British wrapped the body in an army blanket, wound it with barbed wire, and buried it somewhere in a forest near Lüneburg. The location of the grave was classified so it wouldn't become a shrine. It remains unknown to this day. 2 giants had fallen. One went to prison, the other to a nameless pit. But these were just the tips of the iceberg. Remaining in the shadows were thousands of officers of lower rank, camp commandants, sadistic doctors, enforcers. They weren't as famous by face, and they had a chance. They began an operation to change identities, which, in its scale, had no parallel. And for many, it worked frighteningly well. While Göring and Himmler played out their dramas, the true professionals of death acted quietly. They understood. Big names and high ranks were no longer assets. They were a death sentence. To survive, one had to become no one. In May 1945, Germany resembled a disturbed anthill. 8 million displaced persons roamed the roads. Liberated laborers, former prisoners, refugees, soldiers of broken units. It was the perfect ocean in which to dissolve. But SS officers had one problem. A specific problem the size of a coin. The blood group tattoo. It was inked on the inner side of the left forearm, under the armpit, so that in case of injury, doctors could quickly transfuse blood. Now, this mark became the Mark of Cain. American soldiers at checkpoints knew about this. The command, "hands up," wasn't given to search pockets. It was to look under the sleeve. If there was a tattoo or a fresh scar in that spot, the conversation was short. Therefore, in those May days, grim surgical operations took place in forests and basements. Officers removed patches of their own skin with knives, burned themselves with cigarettes, used acid. They simulated combat wounds, anything to explain the scar in that specific place. Having rid themselves of the mark, they began to erase their biographies. Take Franz Stangl, a man with a soft face and a quiet voice, commandant of the Treblinka camp. On his conscience were 900,000 lives. 900,000. When the Reich fell, Stangl didn't run to the generals. He put on work clothes, threw away his papers, and simply walked to Austria. He became a gardener. The man who managed a factory of death was now trimming bushes and watering flowers in a small alpine town. He lived in fear. Every knock at the door made him flinch. But no one was looking for a gardener. Or take Joseph Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz. While the whole world hunted for him, he lived quietly for 4 years in a Bavarian village under the name Fritz Hollmann. He worked as a stable hand. He shoveled manure. He grew potatoes. Local farmers remembered him as a polite, slightly withdrawn guy who liked to talk about biology. None of them guessed that this Fritz had conducted unspeakable experiments. This is the most terrifying part of the Nazis' disappearing act. They didn't hide in dark caves. They hid in plain sight. They became the people we usually don't notice. Construction workers, lumberjacks, truck drivers. They used the chaos of the destroyed registration system. In 1945, you could walk into a town hall, say, "I lost my papers in the bombing. My name is Hans Müller," and get a new certificate. A week later, exchange that certificate for a passport in another city. Thus, an army of ghosts was created. They walked the same streets as the surviving victims. They drank beer in the same bars. They rebuilt the cities they themselves had destroyed. But for the lonely ones, it was hard. Sooner or later, someone might recognize a face. Someone might remember a voice. To disappear truly, one had to go further. To a place where no one asks questions about the past. Across the ocean. But how do you smuggle thousands of criminals across borders guarded by the victors? How do you get visas? How do you buy steamship tickets when Interpol is looking for you? Alone, it's impossible. You need an organization. You need connections. And strangely enough, you need mercy. Help came from where it was least expected, from behind the high walls of the Vatican and the offices of the Red Cross. If you look at a map of Europe in 1945, you see chaos, borders closed, roads jammed with patrols. It seems like a mouse couldn't slip through. But if you overlay the escape routes of certain former officers, a clear pattern emerges. Thin lines leading from north to south, through Alpine passes, into the Italian South Tyrol, and further, to the ports of Genoa and Rome. American intelligence gave these routes a cynical name, the rat lines. But rats don't run on their own. They need a guide. And here history takes its most unexpected turn. Key figures in saving these fugitives were men in robes. In Rome lived an Austrian bishop, Alois Hudal, a man with influence in the Vatican. For him, the defeat of Germany was a tragedy. He saw the fugitives not as executioners, but as fighters against godless communism. He considered it his Christian duty to save them from the victor's vengeance. The system worked like a Swiss watch. A fugitive would arrive at a monastery. He was given food, a bed, and, most importantly, a letter. A recommendation letter from the church confirming that this person was a stateless refugee, a victim of war. With this paper, the man went to the office of the International Red Cross. It sounds wild, but the Red Cross, a symbol of humanitarianism, issued thousands of travel documents to these men. The bureaucrats didn't ask too many questions. If the Holy Father confirmed the identity, then it must be true. They stamped the paper, and a man with blood on his hands became an official immigrant. Take one specific example, the most striking one. One day, an inconspicuous man in glasses walked into such an office. In his pocket was a letter from a priest. He called himself Ricardo Clement, a mechanic. He was issued Red Cross passport number 1940. With this passport, he boarded a steamship in Genoa and quietly sailed to Argentina. No one at customs knew that under the name Ricardo Clement hid Adolf Eichmann, the man who organized the logistics of the Holocaust, the one who sent millions to the camps, left for a new life on a humanitarian visa. The final station of these trails was South America, specifically Juan Perón's Argentina. President Perón didn't just let them in. He invited them. He dreamed of building a powerful army and industry, and he needed German specialists. He created a special service that met them right at the port of Buenos Aires. They were given startup money, new papers, jobs. It was a veritable Nazi international. In the cafes of Buenos Aires, you could meet Joseph Mengele discussing news with former camp commandants. Erich Priebke, responsible for massacres in Roman caves, opened a deli in the resort town of Bariloche and became a respected member of the community. They felt completely safe. They celebrated historical dates. They sang old marches. They believed they had outsmarted fate. The Catholic Church would later say that Bishop Hudal acted on his own initiative. The Red Cross would admit to errors of overworked staff. But the fact remains. Thousands of criminals slipped the noose thanks to this strange mix of misplaced mercy and political calculation. However, the rat lines were the path for those the world considered outcasts, for those whose crimes were too obvious. But there was another category: scientists, engineers, inventors of rockets and jet engines. They weren't forced to hide in steamship holds. They weren't hunted with dogs. On the contrary, a real fight broke out between yesterday's allies for the right to possess them. The USA and the USSR were ready to forgive everything, even slave labor in the camps, if, in exchange, they received the technologies of the future. While Mossad agents and hunters scoured the jungles of Argentina, the governments of the winning countries were doing something else. They were looting, but they weren't interested in bank gold. They were interested in human cargo. There is a black hole in the history of morality, and it is called Operation Paperclip. The essence was brutally simple. American intelligence compiled lists of German scientists whose knowledge could be useful for creating new weapons against the USSR. A simple paperclip was attached to the folders of promising candidates, hence the name. If your file had a paperclip, your past vanished. The most glaring example of this hypocrisy is Wernher von Braun. Today, we know him as the father of the American space program, the genius who sent man to the moon, a man whose name is spoken with reverence at NASA. But in 1945, von Braun's file looked different. SS officer, party member, creator of the V2 vengeance weapon, and most terribly, overseer of the underground Mittelbau Dora factory, a place where rockets were assembled not by engineers in white coats, but by starving slaves. 20,000 prisoners died in those tunnels assembling engines for future spaceships. Von Braun was there. He saw the lifeless bodies. He stepped over them on his way to the drawing board. When American forces found him in Bavaria, he didn't raise his hands. He smiled and proposed a deal. Brains in exchange for freedom. A dilemma arose in Washington. By law, von Braun was a war criminal. His place was in the dock or at the gallows. But the Cold War was beginning, and Pentagon generals decided, better he builds rockets for us than for Stalin. His biography was rewritten. SS membership was called a formality. Involvement in slave labor was called a forced necessity. Von Braun and 1,600 other scientists were secretly brought to the U.S. They were settled in Texas and New Mexico. They were given nice houses, high salaries, and citizenship. Yesterday's enemies became respected Americans. They went to church on Sundays and taught local staff how to build ballistic missiles. The cynicism was off the charts. The man whose rockets devastated London became a hero of Disney space specials. As comedian Tom Lehrer joked, "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Wernher von Braun. The Soviet Union did the same thing, only more bluntly. Operation Osoaviakhim. In one night, October 22nd, 1946, Soviet soldiers woke up more than 2,000 German specialists in the Soviet occupation zone. They were given a few hours to pack. Together with their families and furniture, they were loaded onto trains and taken deep into the USSR. There, on closed islands and in secret labs, they created the Soviet missile shield and jet aviation. Hugo Schmeisser, creator of the famous assault rifle, worked in Ijevsk. Helmut Grotrup, von Braun's assistant, worked on a secluded island. The victors divided the brains of the losers like spoils of war. This is an uncomfortable truth we often forget. The technological leap of the 20th century, spaceflight, jet aviation, stands on a foundation poured with the blood of prisoners. We flew to the stars by pushing off from a mountain of tragedy. The scientists were lucky. Their intellect became their indulgence. But there were those whose talent lay only in giving orders and making speeches. Politicians, field marshals, ideologues. They couldn't be hidden in a lab. Their faces were known by every widow in Europe. For them, the Allies prepared a different show, a spectacle intended to put a full stop to the history of Nazism. They gathered them in the city where Hitler held his grandest parades, in courtroom 600. Nuremberg was chosen for a reason. It was here, at the massive Zeppelin field, that the regime showed its might. Here, they decided to bury it. On November 20th, 1945, the floodlights turned on in the Palace of Justice. 21 men sat in the dock. If you watch the footage, the contrast strikes you. We are used to seeing them in chrome helmets, on podiums, towering over the crowd. Here, they looked small, shriveled, gray. Hermann Göring in a baggy tunic without epaulets. Rudolf Hess with a wild stare. Keitel and Jodl stripped of their batons. For the first time in history, they were wearing headphones. The IBM simultaneous interpretation system was a novelty. It created a surreal effect. The defendants heard the charges against them through the voice of a translator. They twitched, took headphones on and off, grimacing at the static. But the most interesting thing wasn't the technology. It was what was happening in their heads. Psychologists working with them in prison expected to see monsters, demons, but they saw ordinary bureaucrats. None of them, with rare exceptions, admitted guilt. They all had one collective defense strategy: Befehlsnotstand, following orders. One by one they stood up and said, "I was a soldier. I swore an oath. I could not disobey." Ribbentrop said he was just a diplomat. Keitel, that he was just a staff officer. Kaltenbrunner, the man with the scars on his face who led the secret police, claimed he knew nothing about the death camps. It was an attempt to hide behind a dead man. Hitler is to blame for everything, and we are just tools. The only one who behaved differently was Göring. He lost weight in prison, broke his drug addiction, and his sharp mind returned. He turned the trial into his final battle. He dominated. He joked. He humiliated American prosecutors with his knowledge of facts. He didn't make excuses. He was proud. "The victor will always be the judge, and the vanquished the accused," he said. Göring understood he would die, but he wanted to die as a historical figure, not a criminal. On the other side was Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect. He chose the cunning path. Speer admitted general responsibility of the regime, but denied specific crimes. He created the image of the good Nazi, a technocrat who simply built buildings and roads and accidentally didn't notice the horror. This lie saved his life. He got 20 years in prison instead of the gallows. The trial lasted almost a year. 11 months of grueling interrogations. Millions of pages of documents. Miles of film from the camps, from which the defendants turned away or covered their faces. On October 1st, 1946, the verdict was read. 12 death sentences. And even at the very end, Göring managed to strike a final blow. 2 hours before the execution, he bit into a cyanide capsule that someone had smuggled into his cell. He cheated the hangman. He chose his own exit. The others faced the prison gymnasium. 3 gallows were built there. The execution was messy. The hangman, John Woods, was unprofessional. The trapdoors were too narrow, and upon falling, the condemned struck the edges of the platform. The drops were not calculated correctly. It was not instant. Keitel struggled for 24 minutes. Ribbentrop, 10. Their bodies were photographed to prevent legends of their survival. Then they were taken to a crematorium in Munich, burned, and the ashes were scattered into a tributary of the river Isar. The authorities did everything to ensure nothing remained of them. No graves, no relics, only dust in the water. It seemed justice had triumphed. Evil was punished. The book could be closed. But this was an illusion. Nuremberg judged only the top tier, 20 men. But thousands of those who pulled the triggers, released the gas, and signed the deportation lists were still free. They read newspapers about the execution of their bosses while sitting in cozy cafes in Buenos Aires or Damascus. They thought they were forgotten, but there were people in the world who had very good memories. For these people, the trial didn't end in 46. For them, the hunt was just beginning, and it stretched for decades. Years passed. The world changed. The 60s arrived. People listened to the Beatles, wore miniskirts, dreamed of flying to the moon. The war seemed like a distant black and white memory. But for the old men in Buenos Aires, São Paulo, and Damascus, the war wasn't over. It had turned into an endless game of hide and seek. They flinched at the screech of brakes outside their homes. They scrutinized the faces of passers-by, because they knew someone was coming for them. The hunters were few, but they were obsessed. The most famous was Simon Wiesenthal, an architect from Vienna who survived the hell of Mauthausen. He wasn't James Bond. He didn't have a gun. His weapon was a card index. In a small, dusty office, he collected scraps of rumors, old photos, and letters. He pieced this puzzle together for years to find a single thread, and when he found it, he passed the information to those who knew how to act. Israeli intelligence, the Mossad. The most famous operation of the century took place on May 11th, 1960. Imagine the outskirts of Buenos Aires, the San Fernando district, a dark evening, a light drizzle. A group of men stands at a bus stop. They look like ordinary workers. Their car broke down, and they are tinkering with the hood. In reality, they are Mossad's best agents. They are waiting for bus number 203. This is the bus that a man named Ricardo Clement takes home every evening. A balding, quiet man working at a Mercedes-Benz factory. The bus is late. The agents are nervous. If he doesn't come, the operation is blown. But then, headlights cut through the darkness. Clement gets off the bus and walks toward his house. One of the agents, Peter Malkin, blocks his path. He speaks just one phrase in broken Spanish. Un momentito, señor. One moment, sir. Clement puts his hand in his pocket. The agents think he has a gun. They tackle him, bring him to the ground in a ditch, drag him into the car's back seat. In that moment, he realized his past had stepped off the pages of history books and grabbed him by the throat. In the car, they checked him. Scar from appendicitis? Check. Scar under the left armpit where the tattoo was removed? Check. It was Adolf Eichmann. How they smuggled him out of Argentina is worthy of a movie. They sedated him, dressed him in the uniform of an El Al pilot, and dragged him through customs pretending he was a sick crew member. When the plane took off and left Argentine airspace, the entire cabin, filled with agents, erupted in applause. The trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem shocked the world. People expected to see a demon with horns. Instead, they saw a man in a glass booth, a nondescript clerk in glasses who rattled off bureaucratic terms. Hannah Arendt would call this the banality of evil. Eichmann wasn't a maniac. He was the perfect executor who simply did his job well. He was executed in 1962, but not all stories ended in a triumph of justice. The main target of the hunters, Joseph Mengele, remained elusive. He fled from Argentina to Paraguay, then to Brazil. Mossad was literally steps away from him several times. Once, agents even found his house, but the operation was canceled at the last moment due to political reasons. Mengele lived the life of a hunted animal. He suffered from depression. He constantly chewed the ends of his mustache. He was afraid of doctors and hospitals, fearing identification. His end was pathetic. In 1979, while swimming in the ocean at a beach in Brazil, he suffered a stroke. He drowned. The angel of death, who decided who lived and who died, swallowed salt water in total loneliness. His bones were found and identified only 6 years later. For the victims, it was small comfort. He didn't answer for his deeds in court. He died in his own element. The hunt continued into the 80s and 90s. The old men were dying out. But Wiesenthal said, "Longevity is not a merit. Time does not forgive murderers." Trials of 90-year-old men in wheelchairs caused debate. Many said, "Leave them alone. It was so long ago." But prosecutors replied, "Murder has no statute of limitations." The story of Hitler's loyal officers didn't end in May 1945. It dissolved into time. Some hung from the gallows. Some built rockets for America. Some trembled with fear in the jungles. And some died as respected citizens, never telling their grandchildren the truth about what they did on the Eastern Front. Now, looking back at these fates, we can draw a final conclusion. What does the fall of the 20th century's most fearsome men teach us? The 1,000-year Reich lasted 4,482 days. Just 12 years. That's less than a mortgage term. Less time than it takes a child to finish school. But in that brief moment, a group of men, drunk on power, managed to leave a scar on the face of the planet that hasn't healed to this day. When we look at the history of the fall of Hitler's elite, we see a classic tragedy, a Greek drama about hubris and retribution. They imagined themselves as supermen. They rewrote morality. They decided that laws are created for the weak, while the strong create the law themselves. And the higher they flew, the more terrible the fall. Look at their end. None of them died with honor. Hitler took his own life in a basement, trembling with fear of reckoning. Himmler took poison like a trapped animal in a dirty, borrowed uniform. Göring avoided the rope only through trickery, but still died in a prison cell. Mengele drowned alone, afraid of his own shadow. Even those who escaped, who became useful Americans or quiet Argentine grandfathers, lived the rest of their days looking over their shoulders. There was no peace left in their lives. Every